where are your minds and hearts at tonight? Even if you can't fit it into the topic of enjoyment. All right, Kate. Kate or John?
Yeah, it's me actually. And this actually is a question about meditation
Sure.
because I was noticing this evening, I had the thought during the meditation, and it's not unusual. But the thought I had was that it feels as though there is a kind of gravitational field in my mind which attracts thought, story, narrative. It's like, and it almost takes a kind of pressure to hold it back. And I feel like something there is not quite working. And anyways, I'd never had that image of gravity before that, oh,
Yeah, I like it.
it just happened.
It
Anyways, I
does.
just I
Yes.
offer that and I'm curious as to what you would have to say about that.
Sure. It's um, gravity is a good word to describe it. Thoughts just happen, don't they? You don't invite them. It's interesting when you put out the intention to not think, and you notice that. If you don't put out the intention not to think, you never notice that they just happen.
Mm.
Um, they just happen on their own. And when you choose something other than thought to pay attention to, there's an effort to it, like escaping the gravity of one's thoughts, right?
Yes.
There's a little effort each time to notice the thought. And, thoughts generally kind of dissolve when you notice them. But there are some thoughts that seem to have a kind of stickiness to them. You almost want to think them. They're either sticky because you want to think them, or they're sticky because you don't want to think them and they bother you. And that's a different kind of stickiness, but both of them create stickiness, right? And so, you meditate over time, and through kind of just calming down, just kind of the body and mind settling, the thoughts get a little less frequent. There's maybe more moments of stillness. And if you went on a silent retreat where you weren't speaking, you weren't writing, you weren't reading, you weren't feeding the verbal conceptual part of your mind, that kind of stillness would get even deeper. So there's that whole thing. But one thing that I also want to add to that is there's an energy around thought, which I call being in love with thinking. That most human beings are in love with their thinking. They believe that thinking is where it's at. Thinking is where the good stuff happens. We often get paid for our thinking. It's also very entertaining at times. It's stimulating. And so our thoughts are like mediating the world all the time. And there's a sense in the human animal of kind of being in love with thinking. And our energy, even if you feel the energy often tends to be up in our heads, it stays there. I'm not sure it's as much in every culture like it is this one, but we've encouraged our energy to go into our heads through years of schooling, and it's kind of there often. So one aspect of meditative life, or meditative training, you could even say, is a process of falling out of love with thinking. So what do I mean by that? Falling out of love with thinking. If you don't discover the joy of non-conceptual presence, thinking has a much greater gravity to it than it does when you start to discover the joy of non-conceptual presence. When you discover the joy of non-conceptual presence, the ballast starts to shift. The ballast shifts toward really wanting silence. And I don't mean wanting in a craving way. It's actually like the heart starts to fall out of love with thinking and starts to fall in love with non-conceptual presence. Even like the presence that can watch thoughts arise and dissipate, and kind of get fascinated with that, with the fact that thoughts happen on their own. They disappear when you notice them. They have this kind of train that builds off itself. It's a really fascinating thing to watch. And even along with that, they're not yours. As strange as that might sound, thoughts aren't really yours. Simply because they happen on their own, they have their own. It's like this wave of intelligence is like going through and making connections and describing it verbally, and it's doing itself. It's kind of amazing. And non-conceptual presence can see that. It's a little awakening of sorts to really see that. And then maybe you drop into a deeper silence sometime in meditation where thoughts don't bother you, or they're quite wispy. And there's something your heart finds in that experience, some satisfaction that isn't in the thoughts. That's part of the falling out of love with thoughts. You're falling into love with the satisfaction of samadhi, which usually gets translated as concentration, but honestly, the word concentration just sounds like a lot of work, like holding the mind still. I don't necessarily mean samadhi in that sense. I mean rather the heart opening, the energies of the body opening up, the heart opening up in a full way is samadhi. And the heart opens up in presence. There are some thoughts that are heart opening. It's not as though thoughts and heart opening are complete opposites or allergy. The heart has an allergy to thoughts. But there's a different quality there to the presence that we are, which we can call the heart. And thinking becomes much slower, much more full of feeling, coming from a different place, a place full of value and connection, and quite unlike a lot of the thoughts that we struggle with in meditation, which are really more superficial. Figuring it out thoughts, imagining thoughts, going to the future thoughts, going to the past thoughts. Goodness, there's so many possibilities of thinking, aren't there? And yet, when the energy really is in the heart, it's not like there has to be zero thinking, but it's a different quality of thinking. It's saturated with meaning and feeling in a different way. So anyway, that's what occurs to me when you talk about the gravity of the mind. There is a kind of gravity to our thoughts, and yet that gravity can weaken. And the ballast can actually shift. The ballast can shift towards presence and away from thinking. And I mention it because just knowing that there can be a process of falling out of love with thinking, it shifts it. It's not so much that thinking is just like, okay, notice the thought, come back to the breath. Notice the thought, come back to the breath. There's a certain way that meditation is taught that way, and you miss the heart of it. You miss the actual value that's being discovered in that movement away from conceptual thinking. If you know that, if you have a sense of, okay, can I begin to get to know non-conceptual presence, to enjoy it even love it, that will begin to drain the thoughts of their gravity. All right.
Mark, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks for asking the question.